So welcome to panel 2. This panel will focus on 3 different successful Massachusetts-based issue campaigns with an eye to identifying the largest obstacles to the goals of the campaign. Speakers have been asked to explain the strategies they use to overcome these barriers so that we can learn from their work and extract lessons for our own work. I'm going to introduce, I think, all 3 of the speakers in the interest of time. I'm hoping they're all here. First, we have Sonia Chang-Diaz, who is the first Latina and first Asian American elected to the Massachusetts State Senate and the first woman of color to ever make the ballot for governor in state history. As a leading progressive thinker and advocate for racial and economic justice, she spent her career crafting and winning transformational policy across education, economics, criminal justice, immigration, and LGBTQ rights. On this panel, she will talk about how she worked with allies to pass the Promise Act, later renamed the Student Opportunity Act, which significantly increased funding to poor school districts. Also on the panel, Harris Gruman, who is the executive director of the SEIU Massachusetts State Council. He has been an officer of the Raise Up Massachusetts Coalition since its inception in 2013. Before SEIU, he was director of Massachusetts Neighbor to Neighbor. Hi, Harris. And in these roles, he has expanded childcare worker organizing and funding, increased progressive taxes, helped create major new paid leave programs, and elected candidates at all levels of government. On this panel, he will speak about the successful Raise Up campaign that he helped lead to increase taxes on income over $1 million, the Fair Share Amendment. And this funds public schools and public transit. The third speaker, Tricia Farley Bouvier, is proud to represent her hometown of Pittsfield. She began her career as a teacher and taught students overseas in Belize and Uruguay. After serving 4 years as a city councilor, Representative Farley Bouvier was elected to the state legislature in October of 2011. She is co-chair of the House Progressive Caucus, where she has built the membership from 28 to now 65 members of the 160-member House. On this panel, she will talk about her years-long effort to pass the landmark Work and Family Mobility Act, which allows for all drivers in the Commonwealth to be trained, licensed, and insured, regardless of immigration status. So thank you to the panelists. I'm looking to see, I see.
Sonia is not in the meeting yet.
All right, so maybe what we'll do is we'll start with Harris and then just keep rolling, and Sonia will join us when she arrives. I've asked each panelist to speak for 10 minutes, which should leave us around 30 minutes for questions. You're welcome to put questions in the chat, specify for whom you want the question, and also we'll do hands. So Harris, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that, Martha. Thanks for the nice introduction. And Martha made an excellent suggestion that I focus on the obstacles, the key obstacles we faced and how we overcame them, which I think is a perfect way to learn from what we did on this progressive tax victory. So I'll start with the first obstacle we had to overcome was how could you have a viable campaign that has to go to the state ballot and win on taxes. This, death and taxes, right? I mean, it is, no matter how good your idea is, this is a very challenging one, much more challenging than the minimum wage or paid family medical leave and other things we did. So that takes us back 110 years to the ban on progressive income taxes in Massachusetts. Financial interests put that in the state constitution in 1915, and it's been there ever since. And so in 2010, there was this realization that we had a very unfair tax system in Massachusetts, that the rich pay basically half as much percent of their income on state and local taxes than everyone else. So we had a tax fairness commission run by the legislature and the governor, Governor Patrick. And the finding of that commission was the only way we could get toward a fairer tax system was to have a constitutional amendment for some kind of graduated progressive income tax. So where did that put us? Well, it put us in a bind because many people had tried this over the preceding century, and they had always failed by very large margins because people always at a certain point said, I'll be taxed more under this. I don't want it. And, that's obviously what the opposition was saying. What happened differently in 2014 was that Tim Foley from 1199 SEIU stepped forward and said, why not a millionaire's tax? In other words, just tax incomes over $1 million, so that the question is just that. So you can ask yourself, do you make over $1 million? And if not, the answer is you won't pay it. It's a little demagogish, but this is what politics needs to be cognizant of, as Mike Connolly said earlier this morning. So anyway, this popular, simple, and very timely way of framing things, because we had just come off this terrible recession, 2008, 2009, and so on. And the Occupy movements turned out very popular slogan, the 1% and the 99%. So polling showed that we were, in fact, a winner at like 70% support, and very strong support. And then we made it stronger by dedicating the funds from it to something we knew people supported, education and transportation. So that got us over that first obstacle. We now had a viable campaign for the ballot. The second obstacle was how to neutralize a well-funded opposition. You see, on the ballot, statewide, money really counts. And the yes question, the one that's trying to make change, is always at a disadvantage because all the other side has to do is sow doubt. And so you need to be able to neutralize that somehow. In the opposition, in this case, was well-funded by definition. I mean, it was basically big corporations and wealthy investors. And so we needed enough media paid for that would neutralize that. And luckily, we had as allies the teachers' unions, MTA and AFT, and their national, NEA in Washington, who really had the funding and the will to win this campaign, partly because it was for public education. I mean, it would fund that, but they also do believe very strongly in fair taxes. And so we were able to match the opposition dollar for dollar. Both sides spent about $25 million on paid media. The third one was how to neutralize a kill shot message. In every campaign, you have to assume the other side's going to come up with a message that just, especially if you're the yes side, will sow that doubt and kill you. And they did come up with it, luckily somewhat late in the campaign. And that was that working class homeowners who now had these $1 million plus houses, like in Somerville, Cambridge, et cetera, would pay this tax. And they really played up something that was very important. They made people angry. They said, they say you are a millionaire. You're a hardworking person who struggled their whole life, but they say you are a millionaire. And now you have to pay a millionaire's tax on your nest egg for your retirement and your kids' future. This made some of our most ardent left-wing supporters bold on us. Many, many homeowners said, I was for you, now I'm against you. And that included public employee union members, left, DSA members. I mean, I can't tell you, it's terrible. How did we overcome that obstacle? Because we had built a coalition that was 100 organizations and very grassroots, we had the capacity to go door to door to 300,000 voters and talk them out of that message. Explain to them that they would not have to pay it because overall their profit income was much below $1 million, even if their home was worth more than $1 million. And that's how we overcame that obstacle. So we overcame those three obstacles through a simple, popular message, a well-funded ad campaign, and a statewide capacity for field. That led to a 110-year victory for progressive taxes, We actually moved our system from a regressive, where poor people and middle class people actually pay a higher percent of their incomes in taxes than rich people do, to a proportional one where everyone pays the same proportion. That is not a progressive tax system. That is an interim step between the two, but it is a huge improvement. And we raised adequate revenue, $1.5 billion a year, minimum estimate, that we will now be able, and all coming from the top 1%, to fund public education and transportation. But there was one more obstacle that we had not banked on, and that was that our new governor labeled this victory, Maura Healey, labeled it harmful and called for big tax cuts to keep wealthy people from leaving the state. She put forward a plan for $1 billion in tax cuts, 40% of those tax cuts going to the same millionaires we had just asked to pay closer to their fair share. Now, we fought all year, until a couple months ago, and did get some compromises on that. We sort of cut the 40% part in half, and we got a loophole closing that was very important for preserving fair share revenue. But still, this was the most disturbing moment. So it's because we learned that our governor and the legislative leadership, to some extent, are closer to Reagan on taxes than they are to Roosevelt and the New Deal. So it's something to keep in mind. But nevertheless, through those solutions to those three big obstacles I mentioned, we had a 110-year victory for fair and adequate revenue, and it's being spent on great things like free school meals, free community college, major repairs to the T and to bridges in the state, and many other things. So it's one of the biggest success stories I could possibly imagine in my career, and in the career of all of us who, I'm sure almost all of us worked on it, some of us very hard. Thank you.
Thanks, Harris. So be thinking about your questions for Harris. Feel free to put them in the chat. And now maybe we'll move on to Tricia. Do you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you so much. And I'm certainly thrilled to be here with you today and to share this panel with Harris and Sonia, two colleagues that I have always appreciated working with. In passing, what was in the end called the work and family mobility, there truly were many barriers, and I'm going to tell the story a little bit to be able to explain that, because it's going to show some of the mistakes, right, as we went through. So I started to file this bill really when I entered the legislature, because somebody came and pitched this bill to me, and it said, "Oh, this makes sense, and sure, I'll do it." But I was so new at all of this, and one of the reasons I said yes, quite frankly, I knew it had come before and passed, and I knew it had really gained those sponsors a lot of vitriol. I don't know what to say it, but a lot of hate came their way. And coming from the opposite end of the state, nobody reads the Boston Herald in Pittsfield, so I wasn't too worried about that. And my background working with immigrants in English language learning, had me understand the real impact. My students dealt with this all the time, dealt with the inability to drive. So I gave it a try, and I was trying to work on it, and we had, some successes in spreading the message. But then in 2016, when we had the election of Donald Trump, my main partner, Mira Coalition, made the decision that the following session, they were not going to file the bill at all, because they wanted to focus on the Safe Communities Act, because they felt people were in such danger, and they made that decision. I was disappointed, but wasn't prepared to go it alone without the coalition. Fast forward 2 years, and a group had formed, the Driving Families Forward Coalition formed. The Driving Family Forward Coalition was made up of, it was really funded by unions, SEIU 32BJ, and what's the other funder, Harris, that the major funder? There were two major funders.
Well, the two main leaders were the SEIU
and the Brazilian Workers Center, right?
Workers Center,
right.
Yeah.
And so, but then there was a broad coalition under them. And when I say broad coalition, I mean of organizations, right? So there was a there were the chairs and the steering committee and the members. And it was very, very broad coalition. And then they then brought on supporters. And well, then they, we connected as, a longtime sponsor. I got a partner in Christine Barber from Somerville, Brendan Crichton from Lynn, and then eventually Adam Gomez from Springfield. And the work then was to continue to build out that coalition. This is very important, and I really hope that this part of the message gets through. And that is, the coalition needed to be built with not the usual suspects, is what I always say, right? So these, we wanted to pass a very progressive policy, but we couldn't do it with progressives alone. We had to do it with a very broad coalition. And so getting businesses on board. First, it was businesses that were immigrant owned. And then it was businesses that had immigrant employees. Then it was businesses like insurance companies that could see that their businesses would improve with more customers. And this is a way to get more customers, is to have more drivers, to buy insurance, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly faith-based organizations were a very important part of it. That's really how we got a lot of that grassroots work going. Then another important part, and this wasn't really, this was a different kind of gaining support, but it was very intentional work, very intentional and strategic work of looking at where our supporters were in the legislature, who was missing. And when there was somebody missing, many people missing so far, we worked on talking to law enforcement in their district. This was difficult slog work to do this work, to talk to each individual chief, to talk to groups of chiefs. And then, so those individual conversations were important. And then also important was we worked with Chief Kais, who was the head of the major city chiefs organization. And because he had problems with the actual language of the bill. And he said, well, this doesn't make sense to us. And they wanted to make it stronger and narrower. And so we had to work with them. And we were pleased to work with him. He was a wonderful partner. He was tough on us, but he was a really good, credible partner. And having credibility is really important in this business, right? Is, to respect the other side, even though we don't agree with every part of it. And with that, we were able to build and build and build. Now, inside the building, I was working on this other thing I've worked on for years, and that is to build the capacity of the House Progressive Caucus. And as was mentioned before, the House Progressive Caucus membership has grown significantly. And we're, starting to get attention. And, there's a lot of politics inside this building that are complicated. We don't have to get into now. Just because you have the numbers doesn't mean you have the vote. Like, we're not a voting bloc. We've never pretended to be a voting bloc. But when the last session came about, we decided to work hard to get the Driving Families Forward, or the Work and Family Mobility Act, to be the priority legislation, the #1 priority legislation of the House Progressive Caucus. We had a new speaker. The speaker had every reason to work with progressives. And we were able to show him with a lot of work, it wasn't easy, that we had the votes to pass this. We're finding this speaker to be, and it was a surprise to me personally, but he cares about what things can get passed. And when he saw that this could get passed, he was willing to put everything into it to make sure that it did. So building the most important message I think I can give today is that to get progressive legislation passed, you have to work with people outside the progressive circles because it takes more than progressives to get progressive legislation passed. So we were able to pass it in the House and then in the Senate. Some people came along with great joy for this, and some people came along reluctantly. But we were able to pass it with a much stronger majority, certainly than we went into that, even that last day with. Sadly, but not surprisingly, the governor vetoed the bill, and we were able to overcome the veto. Very sadly, when the governor, this Governor Baker, vetoed the bill, he lied. And he said that the reason I'm vetoing it is it'll be easier for people who aren't eligible to vote if they have a driver's license. That's just not true. And that set a tone for the, because after it was passed and, you know, veto overridden, then a ballot question came on to overturn it. And they used that exact messaging to try to overturn that at the ballot. And so that same coalition, who were completely exhausted, they really dug in deep and had to fight a ballot campaign, one that was difficult to message, but they were able to do it. And this was the same ballot that we were on with the Fair Share Amendment. So we were fighting those two battles at the same time. So, and we won. And so we won in the House, we won in the Senate, we overrode a veto, and we won at the ballot. And I'm proud to say that people now have driver's licenses in their hands. And one more thing, and I know my time is up, that the difference elections make because the current governor and her team embraced this policy, worked hard to make sure that it went as smoothly as possible. And it is hard to make a change like this at the RMV, but instead of seeing signs that said, you know, what don't you understand about illegals, you know, on signs, I went to my local RMV and there was a table with balloons and welcome signs and, you know, come here and get your license. And it was really, it's been terrific. So I hope that's helpful to you. And I'm happy to hear from my colleague Sonia and answer any questions.
Thank you, Tricia. We'll turn to Sonia if she's arrived.
Yes, Sonia is here now. She was in
Great.
traffic, I understand.
Hey guys, I'm here. Sorry to be a nail
Let's see if
biter.
I can get her on screen here. Okay, there she is.
Welcome, Sonia.
Thanks, Martha. Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Excellent. Tricia, hi, Harris. I'd like to be with you guys today. To SEIU, I just on my mad dash through traffic passed by a 32 BJ event out at the Arboretum. I'm not sure what was being protested, but it was lovely to see them out. So you guys asked me to talk about the Promise Act, Student Opportunity Act campaign and victory, which I'm thrilled to do. It's one of maybe my favorite child of my legislative victories, although it's always hard to choose. So I'll just give like a speed, maybe 30-second like chronology for people who aren't familiar with it, and then try to answer the targeted question of sort of what the biggest obstacles were and how we overcame them. So for folks who aren't familiar with it, the Student Opportunity Act, which was originally dubbed the Promise Act, so some people know it as that, was a sort of generational overhaul in the way that we fund pre-K through 12 education in Massachusetts. And it contained many wonderful pieces, but for me, the heart of it was, and the biggest fight of it was, that we as a state doubled our investment in lowest income students in Massachusetts, fully doubled, made it, increased by 100% the effort that we are putting in to the public education of students living in the highest density poverty communities in the state. And we hadn't done a major overhaul in the way that we fund K through 12 education since the early 90s, when we first established the state funding formula for K through 12 education. So it was long overdue. So the quick chronology is that, and I should say, I think we now have, as of a couple of years ago, I haven't done a fresh look since in the last couple of years, but as of a couple of years ago, it brought Massachusetts into the place of having the most progressive school funding formula in the country, arguably, where we should be. So, in late 2014 through most of 2015, there was this nerdy group of experts and a few legislators that had been, named to this panel called the Foundation Budget Review Commission. And we were meeting, there were public meetings, but nobody was really paying attention. It was just a sort of, quiet, nerdy commission, as we have many of. And then in fall of 2015, the FBRC, that commission, made its final report. In 2016, the FBRC reforms passed for the first time via the budget in the Senate. The House refused to pass it that year. In 2017, 2018 was the first full session that the FBRC reforms that were recommended in that report were filed as standalone legislation. The Senate again passed it. And in late in 2018, in the summer of 2018, the House also, and with love and respect to Tricia, who was one of the great supporters of the Promise Act along the way, I will say, I'm not going to mince words here, that the House passed in late 2018 a shell version of the FBRC reforms. We got it into conference committee. The conference committee stalemated, and then in 2019, we came back with a revised, more ambitious package of legislation. That's when it came to be titled the Promise Act. There was a huge campaign behind it. And in fall of 2019, the bill was passed into law. And now we are about halfway through the implementation schedule of doubling that investment for low-income kids in Massachusetts. So that's the big chronology, the quick chronology. Three biggest obstacles that I would name that we faced in that 5-year campaign overall. I'll give the sort of 1, 2, 3, and then go back and try to go into them. And I'm going to actually just turn on my timer a little bit to try and not go too long. First obstacle I would say is that the whole thing, the whole package, almost didn't become an ambition for us as a state and for us as progressives in the first place. And I'll come back to that. Second obstacle is what I will call overcoming doing nothing. And this is one of my favorite sayings in organizing and activism, which I'll attribute to Stephanie Pollock back before she worked inside the transportation agencies for the state. But she once said, and it was one of the smartest things I ever heard, that rule number 1 in policy advocacy and organizing is you have to take doing nothing off the table as an option. And so that would say is our second biggest obstacle. And then the third one, I took right from the sort of sample list that Martha, that you guys gave me, which was powerful enemies. And in this case, our powerful enemies were from inside of government, namely the governor and the then Speaker of the House, rather than sort of corporate baddies from outside of government. Now there's certainly plenty that corporate actors did. They would come before the education committee all the time and say, you need to invest more in this, that, and the other. And then when we would see them at the revenue committee, they would testify against the fair share amendment and things like that. So it was there was a non-assistance coming from the business sector in some ways, but our biggest obstacles were from inside our own government. So back to the first one, it almost didn't become a thing in the first place. This was in those quiet days, those quiet months of the Foundation Budget Review Commission meetings. We almost, that commission almost adjourned and issued its final report, which we were tasked with making recommendations about how to meet the state's education goals with our funding formula. And we almost adjourned and issued a final report in that commission without saying a damn thing about our near largest in the nation or largest in the nation, depending on which metrics you look at, achievement gaps between upper income students and low income students. Not a damn thing. And I had to, sort of proverbially lay down on the tracks in this commission in our second to last or last meeting and say, are we really gonna do this? Are we really not gonna say anything about achievement gaps and how to solve them? And we were able to overcome that barrier for a couple of reasons. One is, and I'll break it down a little bit to sort of sub obstacles. I think that almost happened that we said nothing. One, because there were barely any people who are directly impacted by that problem in the room. I was the only person of color and the most person of color in that room of education experts, supposedly from across the sort of professional spectrum. And I really truly believe that had there been more folks from low-income communities, from communities of color, that we would not have arrived at the last meeting, second to last meeting, without this issue being much more at the forefront. Second problem here was that there was an acquired, and a learned belief by the parties in the room who it turned out did want to do something more, did want to call for something more ambitious when they were pushed to by me. But there was this acquired belief that the legislature would never do something that ambitious, would never tackle a problem that big and frankly that expensive of closing opportunity and achievement gaps between low income and wealthy communities. And we as progressives and we as underserved people so commonly do that. We negotiate against ourselves from the get-go. And we ask for what we think is likely to get a yes, rather than what will actually solve the problem. And then the third thing that I think contributed to this, it almost never getting born, is just the tactic of the quiet, polite running out of the clock of the work of the commission. It was unspoken until the last meeting. And we filled that time with lots of technical presentations and polite, technical, interesting and legitimate and relevant conversations about other issues in education finance, but not about the big elephant in the room. And so I would just, flag that as a beware of the running out of the clock in ways that feel not malicious, but in fact do harm our goals as a progressive agenda. Second big obstacle. So, I'll just say, before that second to last meeting, I realized this was going to happen, that if I didn't say anything, the report was going to get issued. It wasn't going to say anything about achievement gaps. And I started making calls and I started doing just that one-on-one, person to person organizing with other members of the commission and said, I'm going to call for an extension of the commission. We need to tackle this issue. Can I count on your vote? It was, the sort of internal equivalent of canvassing. To make sure that I had enough numbers with me to force an extension of the work of the commission and to make sure that we did this work of making recommendations about how to close opportunity and achievement gaps. And if we hadn't gotten, and we got that extension, we worked for 4 to 6 more months. And what we said in the report was, in addition to doing all these other things to fix, these technical problems with our education funding formula, we need to double our investment in low-income students if we mean to do this right. And that was, the core of what became the Promise Act ultimately. So second big obstacle, overcoming doing nothing, right? You have to take that off the table as an option. And, in all things, whether it's, politics, organizing, physics, you name it, engineering, it takes a sizable force to overcome inertia. And the two easiest ways to do that in politics and organizing and policy work are money and, or having one of the big three, right? The speaker, the Senate president, or the governor are sort of on your side or really wanting to do the thing. And so I would say, having one of the big three already want to do the thing is more of a rarity and sort of not something that I think we can sort of put into the progressive playbook. So, I'm going to go to money as the more likely biggest obstacle that again, you're going to face as community. And so you have to do, you know, the things that are going to overcome that dearth of money, right? And let me say in the chronology of how this bill came into law, that in 2018, when we didn't succeed, we didn't get the bill in 2018, but when we got the bill into conference committee, when the House passed that shell version in June or July of 2018, I knew that we had finally overcome this obstacle. We had taken doing nothing off the table because the House was signaling through their actions that, you know, they wanted their members to be able to go home at election time, you know, in the summer and the fall of 2018, and be able to say, I voted to pass the Foundation Budget Review Commission reform. Whether or not, you know, substantively the bill had that, they wanted their members to be able to say that. And so doing nothing was too uncomfortable for them. The way that we did this was, you know, organizing. It's not easy, but it's not complicated. So doing the organizing, it has to be inside organizing, inside the building. It has to be outside the building organizing. And you know, Tricia sort of spoke to this in talking about the Working Family Mobility Act, right? Just that very focused, dedicated, and time-consuming work, right? Of having lots of one-on-one conversations or organization-to-organization conversations, as it is with external to the building organizing. You know, we did it with the geographic span of lead sponsors that we had on the Promise Act, with myself, Mary Keefe from Worcester, and Erin Vega from Holyoke, right? So we had the east-west span of the state. We did it with our co-sponsors. We did it with, you know, a core group of Senate members and House members that met on the regular to do that work of counting heads and going and, you know, bringing more votes and more votes and more votes to the cause. We did it with reaching out to Republicans, reaching out to business leaders, to mayors, to the Mass Municipal Association, to pro-charter schools folks. So we did not, you know, we didn't say there's nobody, we said there's nobody we're not going to work with. You know, if they are willing to work with us on this issue, we want them in the coalition. It requires a lot of time and focus. You have to decide along the way what not to do if you're going to be able to invest that kind of time in organizing work. And that, I think, and I mentioned that just because it's really hard for progressives to decide what we're not going to focus on. And I, you know, I heard this again when Tricia mentioned about the Safe Communities Act becoming a priority for Mira, and the difficult decision to put aside the Working Family Mobility Act. And these are really painful decisions, but I think we have to tell ourselves the truth about this, that they are, you know, a constituent piece of victory, is that we have to decide where we're going to focus our fire. Here I'll also say inside outside game, having both, you know, not just doing one right but not the other. It's really essential to have both, and to invest in that sturdy coalition building, so that when the pressure moments come, and they will, that you can count on your team being strong internally. It also helps to have some people in your crew that do have money. It's not, you know, a must, but it really helps, because if you are going to do the third thing, which I think really helps overcome this obstacle, it does help to have some resources at your back, which is a strong communications campaign. And for us in the Promise Act, that really meant defining and controlling the terms of debate. You know, we worked really hard, and we were successful at defining what does it mean to do education funding reform. You know, does this much count, or does it not count unless you really do this much? What does it mean to pass the Foundation Budget Review Commission reforms? Does it count if you do 2 of them out of the 5, or does it only count if you do all 5? So defining and controlling those terms of debate, and that takes consistency across your coalition. So those are the sort of the anatomy of how I think we overcame the relative dearth of money that we had in this coalition. And then the last obstacle was, as I mentioned before, powerful enemies, right? In this case, the Speaker and the Governor really did not want to do these reform. The Senate President was mixed over these 5 years. You know, we had a few different Senate Presidents during that time. Dan Ruthenberg was an incredible supporter. And by the time that we got to Senate President Spilka, you know, the record of the Senate had really been established, and I think it was hard for for Senate President Booker to retreat from that. But some of you may remember how the Senate President also, took me out of the Education Committee chairmanship for that last final year. And I think that was because, my allegiance was really to the communities that we were seeking to directly serve with the reforms of the Promise Act. And in that 2018 conference committee stalemate, there were some things I was not willing to say yes to because I knew we could get a more fulsome victory if we came back next year. And I wasn't willing to say, to take the political bow and say, we got a package, hooray, but leave behind poor kids. And that cost me that committee chairmanship the next year. But it was, in the end, worked out for the best because I think it allowed me to coordinate much more fulsomely with the outside coalition in 2019. And here is, where I'll say what you need to overcome powerful enemies in a campaign like this is three things. One, I think, it sounds corny, but I'm going to say it, courage. You need to start with a core, team of true believers who care more about getting something done than they care about getting earmarks or a chairmanship post or, incentive that might look like getting into leadership. You might still be able to get those things, right? But you need to be willing to let them go in order to achieve the thing. You need to have some people at your core who are willing to do that, some legislators. Second thing you need is strong outside game. Rank and file members of the legislature need counter pressure from the outside of the state house in order to push leadership, in order to sometimes say no to leadership. Look, I can't be with you on this if leadership isn't there. Because I'm getting, I need to be responsive to my constituents on this. And this is a pitfall that I see progressives make a lot, like the progressive advocacy team make a lot. External partners really need to understand how important it is, how important the external role is in this recipe. Because if everybody wants to be an inside player and everybody wants to have access to those big three, this recipe falls apart. It does not work. And that, again, gets back to the sturdy coalition of inside and outside. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Sonia. Thanks for fighting that traffic and getting here. So we have, it looks like 20 minutes for questions. And why don't we start with Michael Hoey? You have a question for Harris, I believe.
Should I unmute? So the question, if I understood correctly, there's a reluctancy of many progressives to vote for a tax increase if they're going to be responsible for paying that tax increase. Is that what was being said? And if it is, why would that be?
Well, it's a very good you asked me to clarify that. When I said at the beginning that we had to pick a tax, like a millionaire's tax, that would be, most people wouldn't pay it. That was not aimed at progressives or left-wing people at all. That was, assuming that a third of the vote is like left-wing and a third of the vote is right-wing and a third of the vote is up for grabs. With taxes especially, that up for grabs third is going to tend to want to move with the anti-taxers. And so we needed something there, that middle group, moderate, or people don't think about these things that much, would say, oh, but it doesn't affect me negatively. It could only affect me positively. What happened toward the end of the campaign is they came up with an argument that did work on progressives, and that was, and everybody else too, that, on your home, which is now worth maybe over $1 million, you might have to pay this tax. But the key thing there is they played on people's identity as hardworking people. So like when I say public employee union members, or, leftists, just rank and file left-wing people in progressive mass, or, DSA or any other organization like that, were susceptible to that argument because it was framed as something that attacked you personally, not as money, but as your identity. So they're saying you're a millionaire and they're going to tax you like a millionaire. And that's what people at the doors suddenly became very hostile about that. Now, when you convince them they didn't have to pay it, they realized they'd been hoodwinked basically, and came back to us. But you had to talk them out of it. It was a 5 to 10 minute conversation with every voter. So yes, I wouldn't blame the left-wing people for being, overly like grasping. It's more like this idea that all my life I've struggled, all my life I've been insecure, and now people are saying I'm rich and they're going to make me pay more money than other people do. I mean, it just made them feel singled out in a very unfair way. So it's very great you raised that, because you have to understand that psychology to be able to work with it. But let me just say one more thing, because we talked about housing in the morning. I mean, home ownership might be, look, I benefit from home ownership now myself, but home ownership, my dad always used to say, and he was a strong New Dealer, was, encouraged as a bulwark against progressive policy. People would become self-interested or, defensive, worried about their housing value instead of worrying about their moral values. And I have to say that campaign really proved that. We only won by 2 points, even though we up until a month before the campaign, we always had at least 65% support. So, that argument works, and it's, home ownership is a double-edged sword. It gets people into the middle class like unions do, but it also, in a different way, makes people more defensive and less generous. And that's why, support for rent control could evaporate very fast.
Frank Farkas, you have a number of questions for Tricia Farley Bouvier. Do you want to ask them?
Yeah, Tricia, great work, and it was a wonderful victory.
Nice to see you, Frank.
Yes,
We did it together.
yeah. So those campaigns, the one that the ballot campaign in the attempt to overturn the Family Mobility Act, those are very expensive campaigns. I'm wondering, do you have a sense of, and they require a lot of boots on the ground. So I'm wondering, do you have any idea how much it actually costs in dollars and cents? And were there TV and radio ads? And finally, did the insurance company they were going to benefit from, did they contribute materially to the success of the campaign?
So I had the opportunity, because you put it in the chat, to cheat a little bit and go on to OCPF while Sonia was talking. And it looks like it was just under $3 million that was spent. That was on the ballot campaign. That's not anything, to try to pass the bill, which there was significant funds for the professional staff used, which is an important part of a coalition, is to be able to have professional staff running it. But so for the ballot campaign, it was about $3 million. I know it did include TV ads in the, but those of course had to be targeted, because certainly they didn't show up in the Berkshires, right? Because we're in the Albany media market, so they didn't spend their money here. By the way, we won of the highest percentage of the state here. So we know that was spent. Whether insurance companies helped to contribute to that, I don't have that information. We'd have to dig a little bit deeper into those funds. Harris, you got that?
Yeah, I was the finance officer for that
ballot. Oh, there you go. I should have gone right to Harris.
A little more than 3 million. Half of it was from SEIU, and half of it was from a mix of unions and some businesses. One insurance company gave a lot. That was the Latino-owned insurance company, and they gave $100,000. And but that shows a combination of self-interest and values, I think, not just self-interest. And some banks, progressive banks did, like, or at least Eastern Bank is sort of progressive. The State Street, I'm not so sure. But, some businesses threw in too, but it was mostly unions, as it usually is. I mean, fair share was almost entirely unions. But the thing about one reason we were able to win was because the opposition had no budget. So they weren't a well-funded opposition, and they didn't have a kill shot message. All their messages, Tricia pointed out the one that they could have run with the money, which was that people will be able to vote who shouldn't vote, people, but they needed at least $3 million too. We had a very good ad campaign and a good grassroots campaign on that.
And to point out that their main motivation for that ballot question was to get people to the polls that would vote for
their governor's
Republican,
candidate.
that for the governor's race. So that was their like last ditch effort to try to get voters to the polls. But you know, we just had to put our heads down and get to work. You asked about boots on the ground. I mean, you saw it here, Frank, in the Berkshires. Again, I'm going back to coalition building, right? I mean, it was not unusual at all for people to be taking Healy Driscoll material, Paul Mark material, Yes on 4 material, Yes on 1 material, right? Like we all did it together, and we had trust in each other enough to be able to do that, because I've been part of many general election campaigns with people saying, you know, I'm sorry, I'm only here for my candidate. I'm only here for my issue. But there was enough trust among this community to be able, and on these issues, to be able to really have people go out and knock doors for all of those. See Martha's hand.
Toss in here that some of the costs of the campaign are ongoing and hidden. You know, I just got to give a shout out to, you know, one of our stalwart progressive brothers, Jamie Eldridge, who was out, you know, counter canvassing at the grocery stores where the Yes proponents were gathering signatures to repeal the Work and Family Mobility Act, and they sued him, you know, for talking to voters and educating them about what the question was about. And you know, Jamie's carrying those legal defense costs on his own right now. So if you have a few,
thank you for reminding us that. Yeah, thank you.
Jamie's legal defense fund.
Actually, we're still paying the legal costs for Jonathan Paz and Wes McEnany too. That's why the committee, you might have noticed, Tricia, is still open.
Yeah.
Shut down, but we haven't been able to pay off all the legal fees for all those spurious lawsuits that Jim Lyons threw at people.
So I have a somewhat mechanical question, which has to do with keeping coalitions together. How formal do the agreements have to be? How do those agreements manifest? And you know, what do you do when there's dissension in your coalition? And maybe Sonia, we could start with you.
It's such a juicy question, Martha.
Why are you way over here? Like, be over there.
Oh, I think that might have just been something meant to be on mute. It's such a juicy question, and I've seen so many flavors of this and seen it work well and not work well. So I'm trying to think, you know, what's the best way to answer. You know, I find that many of the coalitions that I have been a part of over the years, I find that we sort of as progressives have a penchant for sort of process, you know, and like agonizing over process. And I think a lot of the time spent on like formalizing rules and, you know, it sort of, you don't get much, the juice is not worth the squeeze. But that the time spent on relationship building is really where what holds a coalition together and what helps you work through those really difficult choke points, you know, where there's pressure pulling the coalition apart. And I find, you know, the best way to, like, rather than sort of forming a new organization that's going to be an umbrella over everything, I find just like going on a date with people, you know, whether individuals or organizations, on an issue that you have aligned interests on, right? And building the relationship that way, and really spending some time on the front end talking about why you're here, why you care about the issues, fleshing out some of the pain points that you can anticipate right ahead of time. Like, it's gonna get real when, you know, so-and-so calls and says, I don't want you to do that, or when your funders call and say, I'm not comfortable with that, you know, and like, what are we gonna do in those moments? You know, and where are the thresholds where we need to protect one another, and what are the things we can do to protect one another? That stuff really helps. And there's also, you know, understanding what the trust deficits are among some of the players going in, right? Like, I'll go back to the Promise Act organizing. We had, you know, in late 2018, when we were back at the drafting table doing the, you know, sort of redrafting of what would become the Promise Act, I worked a lot with MTA and AFT on the drafting. But I knew also that if it was perceived as just an MTA campaign, right? There would be some messaging weak points there. And also it would not be a right, that's not the way that I want to organize, right? Because this is also for the parents and the students in low-income districts, and they need to be at the governance table of the organizing coalition. And there's trust deficits, between these very small grassroots organizations and some of the big statewide organizations. And you need some like glue people, in the coalition who can talk, who can be received with trust by the different parties to the coalition, and bring them to the table with one another when they're not used to working with one another. I mean, that was also true, right? Like, people who aren't in the education space might not know this, but like the school committee members and the superintendents have a lot of historical beef with each other, and sometimes they work together and sometimes they don't. And the pro-charter people and the anti-charter people. And so, being able to have trusted emissaries that can, that have credibility with all of those sides helps a lot, and doing the relationship building work on the front end and really getting people in the room so they can see each other face to face and, it's slow, but start building their trust in one another and not just through those emissaries, I think is really important. I'll also say, like, I lean on the side of the optimal size of a coalition for me is whatever size it is, where everyone is really doing work and not necessarily building it to be as big as it could possibly be on paper, but where not everybody is showing up and not everybody is sort of there for the painful moments, because I think that those coalitions break easily. They break easily and they're just not as effective. And so I think there's a value in sometimes staying smaller than you might be able to be on paper.
And I'd like to chime in here about the coalition. I do think I had mentioned before that part of it, if you're really going to change a big policy like this, there needs to be full-time professional staff that's working every day and keeping things together. And that is hard, right? Because it's going to take money, it's going to take professionals, it's going to take professionals to stick around, right? So all of that is important. And I can't agree with Sonia more when I say it's about relationship building, and that those pain points are going to come. There was a point where things really looked like they were just going to completely split. The legislators and the coalition were going to completely split, but it was our relationship with the co-chairs that we were able to come back together. And I don't want to say rebuild the trust, because the trust was there. It was just such a hot point, right? That we just had to remind ourselves of that trust and that relationship that we had with each other as people, that kept us together and kept us going in the work. The other thing to point out is within the coalition, the outside the building coalition, there were like, I don't know, I wasn't so much into the outside the building coalition to know the details of it, but there were these subgroups that did work. So there was a comms team, for example, that helped us with the communication. There was the team that was really very focused on law enforcement. That really made a difference. And then there was the legal team. And especially at the end, I can see Laura's here. She's part of that team. We had to have like instant meetings, right? Pop-up meetings in the middle of the day. Can you meet at 11:15 so we can talk about this sentence in the bill, right? And we were able to rely on them for really expert work, not just like, this is what I think, this is what we can get through. This is what the law means, and being able to have that expertise in the coalition was invaluable. And then at the end, I really want to say, because I know we're going to run out of time, is I at some point gained some clarity, a couple of years out before it finally passed. And that was, the goal was to get the license in people's hands. And everything else had to go to that goal, and all the extra stuff had to fall away. And I just kept saying, the license has to get into the person's hand. I didn't get everything I wanted in this bill. Just be really clear about that. And, there was a lot of hard feelings. There was a lot of things happened. Okay. But in the end, people have licenses. So I really thank people for being here, especially all my Berkshire friends.
Harris, I think we have like 3 minutes left. Do you have any thoughts or experiences to share about like how to keep the coalition together and raise up?
Well, I guess I have to say, people say, what do you do for a living? I say, I'm a coalition organizer. Because I mean, even the SEIU State Council is a coalition. Sometimes I joke, the broadest coalition I have to pull together. But it is it's always the challenge. But I do think Raise Up Massachusetts, which did the Fair Share Amendment, and the Driving Families Forward, which did the driver's license, have to be two of the best coalitions I've ever seen for keeping an eye on the prize. And I only not mentioning the Promise Act because I wasn't really at the center of that, but I'm sure the same is true for anyone that succeeds. Keep an eye on the prize, having a kind of a command structure that allows you to respond quickly, like Tricia was describing with those last minute meetings, but also very clear what has to go to the whole group, what has to be voted on, by the legislature of the coalition, and not just by, the Speaker of the House or whatever you want to call them. We have chairs of the coalition, we have a steering committee, we have specialists like comms and organizing and fundraising, but we also have to have the coalition as a whole, and that coalition as a whole they have to know they have the final decision on the substantive things. And we've proved that with both those coalitions, and that is why they carried through and succeeded, because there was that balance between making decisions in a hurry and, strategically, but never leaving out the democratic voice of the coalition where it mattered. And that's kind of an art that you have to really know what has to go to the whole group and make sure that happens, even if it takes time, but not let process kill you on the other end by saying everything has to go to everybody all the time. It's a tough one because you're up against enemies who have a very top-down command structure. So you can't just give them the victory because they just act, but you can't you won't move forward if the coalition doesn't move forward together.
Martha, I'd like to just mention one more thing, and that is after the victory, you can't leave people behind. And I'm going to give you a clear example of that is that we, my legislative partners and I, made a decision that nobody that voted for the driver's license bill would lose their election. And we worked really hard to get them boots on the ground and money to make sure they didn't. I think I saw Carol Doherty get on here. This was a really hard vote for her. And it was imperative that she not lose, not only because we care about Carol and her great work, but because it would send a message that voting for anything immigrant would be a losing vote. And we've heard that for 20 years, right, in the legislature. And nobody did lose. And quietly, with zero fanfare, another significant immigrant policy passed in this year's budget, and that is in-state tuition. And it was no problem to pass this bill because it's like, oh, voting for immigrants isn't a terrible thing, I guess. And so you have to have people's backs after they take a vote. And I think that this is something that this coalition, my audience today, our audience today can keep in mind, like support the people who are supporting you, right? And on these things, it really is important. Thank you.
Well, I just got to add one thing. I really appreciate that line you gave us, Sonia, about, I guess from Pollock, that you have to take do nothing off the table. And that's a very hard thing to do because it's easy to do nothing. So you really do have to say something has to be done here. And in all three of these cases, that message got through.
So I want to thank all three of you for participating in the panel. Hugely helpful. A large number of us are, working in coalitions, trying to build up coalitions. And, thank you for sharing your experience, your victories, and how you got there.